we're just, I was just thinking that it's going to be a busy month in December. I always like to call it the Holly Days, D-A-Z-E. So we're going to try to minimize what happens at the league. But before then, I'm Charles C. Kaler. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Lane County. And welcome to our speakers coming to you on third Thursdays. Speakers series coming to you on third Thursdays. Brought to you virtually with help from Rhonda Livesay and Nancy Mills. We live on the traditional land of the Kalapuya people, whose descendants are citizens of both the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. We honor the land and the people who have cared for it and reaffirm our commitment to steward and honor the land through our league's work. Okay, after the speaker's presentation, we'll have time for some questions. You can begin to ask now and after they come to mind via Q&A or chat, and we'll save them for later. Right now, though, to preface Alex Biddle's presentation, I'd like to quote 1000 Friends of Oregon's board president, Eloise Kohler, who said in October, "Because holding our breaths and waiting for rain isn't actually a solution, 1000 Friends of Oregon is leading on building our state's wildfire preparedness and resilience in the unique area of our expertise, land use planning. Oregon's iconic land use planning system gives us tools no other state has to balance the conservation of our farm, ranch, forest lands, and natural areas with livable, compact towns and cities that include housing for all and provide walking, bicycling, and transit options for getting around. Embedded in the 19 goals of our nearly 50-year-old system are solutions that can protect our communities from the dangers of wildfire and climate change." Unquote. Many of the League's positions echo the same goals, and we often partner with 1000 Friends to achieve those ends. Our speaker today is a person with an amazing mix of accomplishments and experiences. Just to name a few, he has a master's degree in planning and a law degree. He's been a taxi driver, and among his many outdoor pursuits is a champion stone skipper. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Alexis Biddle, who is 1000 Friends of Oregon's Great Communities Program Director. Alex, you're on.
Great. Charlie, I can't even, that was too much. But I will say I'm not a champion stone skipper. I have competed in the world championships. But
close enough.
Anyways,
I bet you're the champion in Oregon, right?
Maybe, I don't know. There's probably somebody better. There always is. Well, great. It's an honor and a privilege to be speaking with you all this morning, or I guess it's afternoon at this point. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we can get started. So, as was mentioned, my name is Alexis Biddle. I'm the Great Communities Program Director and Staff Attorney for 1000 Friends of Oregon. And today we're going to be talking about a little bit of background on Oregon's land use and housing. And actually, I just wanted to start with a little story. It was already mentioned that I was a cab driver when I was in law school. And that is actually what got me really inspired to take the career path that I'm on now. So when I was a cab driver, I noticed I was taking some time off of law school because I wanted to go into law to work on climate change related work. And then I realized after my first year of law school that it might be more advantageous to work on policy rather than litigation. And in that time that I took off to really consider my options, I was a cab driver, and a lot of the customers that I was driving around in Eugene and Springfield were folks that couldn't afford a car, and they also didn't live in walkable communities or have good transit access. And so they would end up taking cabs to go to places like doctor's offices and to grocery stores to meet their daily needs. And when you think about a cab ride, it is at least $10 to $20, depending on where you live for most trips. That's adding a really significant bill onto people's, basic necessities. And it also just really kind of tied together for me some ideas around how equity and sustainability are very closely linked. When you look at, where the people that are, and most in need often have the most, they have to have they sometimes have the highest expense just to meet their daily needs. So another $20 on your grocery bill, when that might be one of your bigger bills of a week, that adds up over the long run. And that really inspired me to think about how I can work to link together environmental concerns and social equity work. And I was really lucky that I had a mentor in law school. His name is Rob Zako, and he's the co-director, or he's the executive director of Better Eugene Springfield Transportation. And that he had worked for 1000 Friends of Oregon in the past, and he kind of inspired me to set a goal to work in this type of work, especially with 1000 Friends of Oregon. So I just want to give that little background before I started. And also, by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time if there's questions. I'm happy to answer questions in the middle, or we can save for discussion at the end, just whatever people feel comfortable with. But here's a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I just want to do a brief history of 1000 Friends of Oregon, an overview of Oregon's land use system, and then really dive a little bit deeper into Goal 10 and urban issues, talk a little bit about our recent work on wildfires, and some more specific work on House Bill 2001, which is in the phase right now of being implemented at the local level, and some other work on the horizon that deals with housing. So, and actually, I think I'm going to talk about wildfires last. I forgot to reorder this list, but anyhow, 1000 Friends of Oregon was founded in 1974. It was 1 year after the passage of Senate Bill 100, which was the Senate bill that began Oregon's land use system. Back in the 60s, there were some studies that showed that the Willamette Valley was developing at a rate such that within the next 100 years, there would be no real productive, viable agricultural part of our economy, which in the 60s was the largest sector of our economy in Oregon. It's now the second largest sector behind technology. It's like Intel and other organizations like that, and closer to Portland. But we had a young, inspiring attorney named Henry Richmond, who was really the force behind 1000 Friends of Oregon. And he talked with the famous Governor Tom McCall to get his backing of this new organization. And originally we were called the Oregon Land Use Project. We've always been informally known as 1000 Friends of Oregon, but it wasn't officially 1000 Friends of Oregon until 1980, sometime in the 1980s. And 1000 Friends got its name in our initial fundraising drive, Governor McCall asked that we get 1,000 people to donate $100 for our initial budget of $100,000 to hire both our executive director, Henry Richmond, and 2 staff attorneys. So that gives us some sense for inflation nowadays. And we started in 1974, and some of the bigger cases we worked on included in the 1980s, we worked around the issue of the Rajneesh developments in Eastern Oregon, if anyone's familiar with that. And we really, the organization is responsible for a huge portion of the litigation that really brought teeth to the land use system of Oregon. If you're looking through case law related to Oregon's land use system, 1000 Friends of Oregon's name appears larger than, more frequently than any other organization or individuals. And the attorneys that we hired really built the foundations of ensuring that the goals that were adopted around Oregon's land use system really had meaning to them, and they weren't just words on paper. So just to give you a brief overview of kind of where we come from, we are a watchdog organization that makes sure that at the local level, cities and counties are implementing the statewide goals faithfully to the intent of the system. And part of the reason we were founded was because when Senate Bill 100 was passed, there was a lot of opposition to it from local governments. And we knew that with the state taking more authority around land use planning at the local level, there would be a lot of resistance and attempts to, not actually follow the law. And so we were tasked with making sure that that local governments are held accountable in implementing the system faithfully. And really, the system of Oregon's land use is, there's 19 statewide goals, and I don't want to simplify it too much, but we're really concerned here with protecting and preserving farm and forest land, and at the same time making sure that our communities are as livable as possible and really attractive places that are healthy and really with a high quality of life, so people want to live in our urban areas, and we mitigate development in our more rural and farm and forest areas. So just to dive a little bit more specifically into the 19 land use goals, the first 14 are really focused on comprehensive planning across the entire state. They include the protection of agricultural land, forest land, natural resources, and cultural resources, as well as making sure that inside of our urban growth boundaries, we're adequately providing enough housing, transportation options, making sure that we have enough land and the land zoned appropriately for the type of economic needs that we have, and then also for recreation. And the urbanization goal is also one of the most important goals of the land use system. It relates to, when a city is growing, that we're not just growing willy-nilly and expanding in a unplanned way, but that we're actually thinking about where does it make sense to grow our city, and not just wherever a developer buys land at the outskirts of town and wants to build housing or other things. So it's really about being thoughtful and making sure that we're planning and not just growing mindlessly and without thinking about the long-term consequences. And then finally, there's also a number of specific goals that relate to the coast and the Willamette River that are more area specific, and those are the goals 16 through 19. I think it's 15 through 19. And they really help us deal with some of our more sensitive areas like coastal areas, estuaries, and the Willamette River. So just to give a quick summary, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but the urban growth boundary is one of the most defining features of Oregon's land use system. And here's an image of Eugene's urban growth boundary. Eugene and Springfield used to have a common urban growth boundary until 2009, I believe, and we call it the Eugene-Springfield divorce. And it was basically Eugene, other than Salem and Kaiser, was one of the only cities in the state that has a shared urban growth boundary. And Eugene and Springfield couldn't agree on things, so we now have a separate one. But anyways, the urban growth boundary really makes the separation between urban and rural. And people can, people notice this as they're driving in Oregon. When you're leaving a city, you have this sudden feeling as you're just getting to the edge of Beltline and right before you go to Coburg, that there's a distinct separation between what we have where we have urban uses and rural uses. And the urban growth boundary, so this is distinct from the city limits. And this isn't anywhere to scale, but this is just for the idea. The image here shows that the city limits are smaller than the urban growth boundary. And the urban growth boundary actually has a 20-year supply of buildable land. And that land can be both in vacant land inside of a city, but also to the outside of a city, but within the urban growth boundary for future expansion. And it's often assumed that the urban growth boundary is a static line that never grows, and our home builders and developers often say the reason the housing cost is so high is because we have this urban growth boundary and it's limiting our supply of land. And that's actually not true. We have both a supply of land built into the urban growth boundary, and it can be expanded if cities can show that there is not enough land to accommodate the next 20 years of population growth in a city. So just to also do a quick overview of the steps that a city takes when it expands an urban growth boundary, they need to determine the need for urban development. And they do this through a population forecast, which determines how many people they are going to expect in the next 20 years. This used to be done at the county level, and the counties used to give population forecasts. And it turned out to be a really politicized process where cities that didn't want to grow could manipulate numbers to show that they weren't growing very fast. And cities that did want to grow could show that they were growing and they needed more land. So it really became politicized, and the legislature changed in 2012, I believe, to make it so that Portland State University, they have a population research center, and they do the predicting on a very scientific based way to make sure that cities have accurate numbers for their forecasts. And so cities need to determine need for housing and employment lands based on the population forecast and trends in employment. And then they do what's called a buildable lands inventory, where they inventory all the land inside of an urban growth boundary and really determine how much of the need over the next 20 years can be accommodated within their existing lands. And sometimes they can accommodate more folks by zoning for higher densities in certain areas, and that will help lessen the need for more land at the outskirts of town. And then if necessary, the cities can identify lands at the edge of town to expand their urban growth boundary. And they usually do this within a 1 mile radius, and they have to look at the quality of soils or for agricultural purposes and forest lands purposes. And then they also look at how expensive or difficult it would be to serve the areas that they intend to have an expansion, so that we're both accounting for, if we were to expand an area, would we actually get housing built, or would it be very expensive housing because it's expensive to put infrastructure there, and making sure that we're prioritizing the protection of the highest value lands. So I said that we were going to be focusing on housing today, and I'm just going to focus on this. The goal 10 is a couple pages long, but really it comes down to the heart of it, is that we need to make sure that we are planning in every city that we have housing that meets the needs of the housing needs of households of all income levels. And so it's kind of about the principle of, if you work in a city, you should be able to live in that city. And in a lot of places, as we can see through the housing crisis, is getting more and more difficult for folks to be able to afford to pay the rent, or to find down payment and pay their mortgages because of the high cost of housing. And goal 10 is a very lofty goal. And in legalese, there's a lot of words that sound nice, but don't really mean a lot when it comes to, we call them legal teeth. And like, if you look at the first line here, it says plans should be developed. And should is not a very strong legal word. It just is pretty weak, and it doesn't really tell communities that if you don't do this, you're in trouble. And it really, unfortunately, goal 10 has been something where it's been aspirational. We want to build as much affordable housing as we can in the state, and it's often neglected, and it hasn't been as robustly enforced as the protection of agricultural land, which, if you look at the data for how we've protected farmland, we're doing better than almost any other state. I mean, I think I've seen studies that show that we're actually doing better than any other state, but I don't want to say that right now because I don't remember exactly. But we have among the strongest protections for agricultural land in the entire United States. But with housing, we've really come short, and it's obvious that this has happened through the housing crisis. I'll also note real quickly that a lot of folks tend to blame the urban growth boundary for the housing crisis. But if you look at the evidence, we don't believe that's true. The urban growth boundary, we have one, Washington does not, and California does not, and their housing is more expensive than our housing when you look at just median prices. And the cost of land is higher in other places. And a lot of the reason that we have such expensive housing is because of strong, really restrictive development standards that require, first of all, large minimum lot sizes which is the #1 cost driver in the building of residential areas, is how much land it takes to build a single house. And if you have a large lot size requirement, you have to buy more land for each house. And that really is a powerful and unnecessary tool that local governments have used to increase the cost of housing. And there's a lot of other design standards and things like system development charges that increase the cost of housing. And it's really led Eugene and cities across the entire nation to build more single family neighborhoods. And this used to not be the case back before in the 1940s and prior to that. It was legal to build duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes, smaller, more affordable housing types everywhere. And we had lots of them. You can still see many of them all across our neighborhoods in across Eugene, but especially the older ones. And today we have over 80% of our land in Eugene zoned for only single family housing. And since this has been one of the highest cost drivers of in the price of housing, the legislature finally took steps to start addressing it through the re-legalization of what's known as middle housing. And there's a lot of confusion about what it is. This article, or this diagram shows basically that there's a spectrum of housing, and on the left we see single detached family homes, and on the right is mid-rise apartments that are like what you would see closer to downtown. But if you look in the middle here, there's duplexes, triplexes, little courtyard apartments or cottage clusters, and townhouses. And these housing types are much more affordable to build compared to single family homes, mainly because the cost of land is divided among more units. And I also want to point out and mention that the single family homes are not inherently bad, and a lot of people do need them, and they're not evil. We're not at 1000 Friends of Oregon, we're not anti having single family homes in neighborhoods. It's just that we've built a monocrop of housing types. And if we want to have a diverse community, we need to have diverse housing types. And so it's not about hating on single family homes, it's that we've built such a standard development pattern of single family homes that's really excluded people from our neighborhoods in a way that's really not sustainable or equitable. And so it's really about diversity of housing options, and not prioritizing or making it vilifying one against the other or anything like that. It's really just important that we have a diversity of housing types so that people have choices, realistic choices that they can make about where they want to live. So one other element in this that's not listed in the spectrum is accessory dwelling units. And in 2017, the Oregon legislature took the first step in housing policy at the state level with legalizing accessory dwelling units on all lots that allow single family homes. And an accessory dwelling unit is simply a smaller dwelling unit next to a single family home, so that folks can, if they want, they could build a place and rent it to help subsidize their mortgage payments, or if they wanted to perhaps help an older family member live near them so that they could help take care of them as they age. Or maybe some older folks want to downsize, but they don't want to leave their neighborhood. So they could build a backyard cottage, rent out their larger home, and then still be able to be next door neighbors with people they've been friends with for over 30 years. So it really is a really good tool that the legislature took in 2017. And now even Eugene has finally implemented it. It's just as this last September, they finally passed an ordinance that was compliant with allowing accessory dwelling units in all neighborhoods. So then in 2019, we see House Bill 2001 get passed. And 1000 Friends of Oregon, along with the coalition of, I think it was over 40 different housing providers or housing advocates, including like Habitat for Humanity, Home Forward, and other housing authorities like Homes for Good. I'm not sure if Homes for Good was a part of it, but they are part of a coalition that really pushed for this legislation, which allows for cities between 10,000 and 25,000. They need to allow duplexes on every lot. So it's kind of similar to allowing a accessory dwelling unit on every lot, except for duplexes don't have to have a primary and a secondary unit. They can be two equal units on the same lot. And then cities that are over 25,000 need to allow duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage, like clusters of smaller cottage homes. And I just have a quick breakdown of those. I'm sure everyone understands them anyways, but here's just a visual that, these can really be something, or these types of housing can really blend into existing neighborhoods. And they do a great job at providing more affordable housing, especially in areas that are, already developed and close to downtown. So folks might not need to depend on take a new home that's built at the edge of town and driving into downtown for work. They can do live in current neighborhoods that are closer to downtown, and this really helps us reduce our dependency on automobiles, as well as have more walkable and urban communities. So it's important to note that even though these House Bill 2001 required local governments to allow these new housing types, it doesn't mean that single family homes are not allowed in neighborhoods anymore. Single family homes can still get built, and they will be built, I'm sure, into the future. It's really about reducing barriers to more affordable housing types compared to the cost of new single family homes. And the cities are also required to think about incentives for affordability as they go through this implementation process. And there's actually opportunities right now in Eugene. They just had a hearing on Tuesday night, the Planning Commission, regarding the implementation of House Bill 2001. And the record for that is still open until November 29th. So I'd encourage folks that want to advocate around this to send comments in support of the zoning ordinance that's going through the process right now. And then I can also talk a little bit about some incentives for affordability that we're hoping will be incorporated going forward. So just to put a little bit more detail in what this means. So every lot that allows the development of a single family home needs to also allow a duplexes. And that means that if the minimum lot size for a single family home is 4,000 square feet, then the city can't have more restrictive development standards for duplexes. So that means that a city needs, with 4,000 square feet minimum lot sizes, needs to have a 4,000 minimum lot size or smaller for duplexes. And then it gets a little bit more complicated for the other larger housing, or the larger, more units of middle housing. And the lots for triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters can be larger than the minimum lot size for single family homes, but they have caps at 5,000 to 7,000 square feet, or for townhomes, 1,500 square feet. And generally, this still allows for most of these housing types being built on most lots across single family neighborhoods. And I want to point out to you that well-maintained single family homes are very unlikely to get redeveloped. And this is something that we'll see really gradual change in our neighborhoods. It's not going to be an overnight transformation. This will take generations as houses age, and over the course of the next 100 years even, we'll see a slow incremental change, but we're not going to see a wholesale change of neighborhoods overnight, because developers just won't make money if they're going to buy a nice single family home and tear it down and build another brand new building. It just won't happen with the way the economics of it work. So we're not going to see this happen, overnight. It's going to be a gradual long-term shift. I just want to cover what the law requires. But again, this is another point where, the weakness of legal language can leave something to be desired sometimes. Under House Bill 2001, cities must consider, but consider is not must do, but they must consider reducing or waiving SDCs. That's also known as system development charges, or charges for the infrastructure like sewers and roads and sidewalks that need to be built when we build new homes. That they could reduce them for middle housing types. They also need to consider adopting criteria for a property tax exemption or property tax freezes for middle housing, kind of like the multiple unit property tax exemption that we have for larger apartment buildings in Eugene, which we all know is very controversial. And then there's also the opportunity that cities need to consider a construction excise tax for affordable housing units. And Eugene already has a construction excise tax that was passed in 2019. And it could be improved, but also construction excise taxes need to be balanced so that we're sure that the funds from a construction excise tax can be used to build affordable housing. At the same time, if we have a construction excise tax that's too large, then it might actually suppress the amount of housing that gets built, which could actually hurt the amount of funds that we would generate from it, which wouldn't help anybody if we're building less housing and building less affordable housing. So that's just something that needs to be considered, but Eugene has excise tax already. I think it could be larger, but I'm not an economics expert. And I want to also bring up a couple of points that we're bringing up in our advocacy around House Bill 2001. And there's really two things we're hoping that cities will take advantage of. And one, the city of Eugene is already considering with accessory dwelling units, and that's having pre-approved middle housing designs and lot configurations to streamline the approval process. For developers, time is money. And so having a pre-approved housing design could help them cut some red tape and get projects on the ground faster. The less time that they spend constructing and getting it approved, hopefully the more units can be built in the long run. And this can also, like having a pre-approved designs can also, help meet some of those concerns that communities have around, they want this type of infill development to coexist and blend well into their existing neighborhoods. And so you could have a pre-approved middle housing design that's a little bit more likely to be consistent with what's around them in their neighborhood. And this would both help the developer and help folks that are concerned around having their neighborhoods stay similar to the way they feel right now. And then also, and this one's probably more important in terms of affordability. You could allow cities, and Portland has done this, where they allow a density bonus for having at least one unit in a middle housing plex be guaranteed to be affordable by deed restriction. So if you say for the next 20 years, we're not going to charge more than 80% of the income, or I'm sorry, 80%, sorry, let me start over. So right, like when we talk about housing costs and housing burden, if someone is paying more than 30% of their income on housing, then they are considered cost burdened. And you can make a deed restriction that limits the amount of rent you could charge, so that for someone that's making 80% of the average median income of an area, that they're not spending more than 30% of their rent, of their income on rent. You could also add a density bonus for creating accessible units that are accessible for wheelchairs and under the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then for tree preservation, it's, we really value the importance of a tree canopy, and we don't think that housing and trees should be pitted against each other. We can both I think in the long run, improve our urban tree canopy and provide more housing options. And one way of doing that is to allow for a density bonus when a developer has a lot that there are large trees in the area that could be developed, but they can show that one or two or maybe more trees get preserved. They could add another additional unit that they wouldn't otherwise be allowed, and possibly make a little bit more money, but also preserve trees at the same time on the lot. And those are the main affordability measures that we're at. And I just wanted to bring up examples of other cities. Bend right now is the only other city that has there's ways to allow or that are in the same category of large city as Eugene, and they're the only one, the city that has passed an ordinance yet. And they are allowing both stacked and detached duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes, which means there's basically greater flexibility in the design options. A stacked unit is one that is, one unit on top, one unit below for a duplex. And then, oddly enough, I learned throughout this process that you can have detached plexes, which is it sounds kind of contrary to what most people think about when they think about a duplex, triplex, or quadplex. But people do call these detached units, they still call them duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. And for some odd shaped lots, it might be easier to build a number of units in a detached manner rather than attached. So it could just help more lots pencil for developers to make more housing options. And so we're encouraging Eugene to follow a similar path and allowing both stacked and detached rather than just side by side housing developments. And then Bend has no minimum parking requirements for duplexes and triplexes, and only basically 2 parking spaces per quadplex, or half a parking space per unit. I wrote that wrong, I'm sorry. The main driver behind that consideration is that parking is one of the biggest cost drivers for housing, and it's also something that is it's more permeable surface, and it's worse for the environment to have. And parking spots can cost in excess of over $6,000 per spot when you're talking about the driveways and other things that need to get built. And we know from conversations with developers that it's unlikely that every building is going to have 0 parking spaces, but there are some areas where folks think that the market will still determine that people need parking spots, and they're going to get built, but requiring developers to build them can create some unnecessary cost. And so that's why we're holding up Bend as an example of places that are kind of going the extra mile in terms of reducing housing costs. And then a couple of things I want to talk about, just moving on from House Bill 2001, is House Bill 2003 was passed at the same time as House Bill 2001. And it actually has more of a potential for having on the ground changes over the long run, but it's been much lower profile. One of the biggest pieces of House Bill 2003 is that it requires not just cities, but whole areas or regions to do a housing needs analysis in a coordinated way. Right now, every city does their own housing need analysis to determine how much housing need there is. But we all know that people don't just think of the housing market as only one city. People that are looking for housing in Eugene are often also looking in Springfield or Cottage Grove or Veneta, Junction City in Coburg. And a regional housing needs analysis will really help more coordination and making sure that cities aren't just looking at their own policies, but that they need to look at all of their policies together. And they are also cities over 10,000 in population will be on a scheduled housing capacity analysis program, where the Department of Land Conservation and Development is requiring cities to every 6 years review their housing capacity, so that we're really making sure that we're staying up to date. Because right now it's up to cities on their own to do their own housing needs analysis, and sometimes they aren't checking them as often as they should be. And then one of the bigger game changers of House Bill 2003 is what's known as housing production strategies. And here, cities need to come up with strategies that actually, in a measurable way, will meet their housing needs of folks of all income levels. And this is kind of something that would have been nice if we had adopted it with Bill 10 back in the 70s. It requires that cities actually adopt these strategies, or they will actually face consequences in terms of funding from the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And it still is being worked out at how these strategies will be required, but they're going to need to actually do some zoning changes to make it easier to build, say, apartments along transit corridors or things like that. And there's still some flexibility left up to cities to make these decisions, but once they make them, they have to carry them out and follow through their housing production strategies. And then right now, there's also ongoing work at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. The governor back in 2000, I believe it was 2019, issued an executive order after the failure of the cap and trade bill in the legislature around the carbon cap and trade. And she instructed all agencies in Oregon to do as much as they could under their existing legal authority to address climate change. And so the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking came out of that executive order from the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And it's going to apply to all 8 of Oregon's metropolitan planning organizations. And it's really geared to reduce vehicle dependency, and will create cities, or within these MPOs will need to create climate friendly areas that will be basically allowing for more transit oriented development, more bikeable and walkable communities by increasing the density of areas that can be built near jobs and near bikeable and walkable facilities. So those are some pretty hopeful things that we see in the long run. Oh, I'm just noticing there's some things in the chat. Should I?
I'll deal with that. Because I've got like 6 of my own questions that came up. So, but okay. What do you have another screen? Do you have another?
Well, I have one more slide, so I'll just get through it and then
that will work.
Yep. So, so we all know that wildfires are an increasing problem in Oregon. And the holiday farm fire, I live in Marcola, and I'm home today, and the fire came only 3 miles from my house. And that was a scary time. And it's a scary prospect in the future, knowing that these types of mega fires could be the norm. And we lost the communities of Blue River and other areas along the McKenzie. The Alameda fire in Southern Oregon tore through Talent and Phoenix and destroyed many homes. We lost hundreds of homes last year. And so part of our efforts were focused on, when whole communities are burned down like that, how do we ensure that folks can recover resiliently as fast as possible? And so we worked on the Department of Land Conservation and Development wrote some emergency rules that we worked on to make sure that communities were able to go through a more streamlined approval process to replace their homes. And this was supported by Lane County and other counties around the state. But it was critical towards getting folks back to normal, even though this is going to take many, many years, and there probably will be a new normal, because this type of devastating fire is, community just won't be the same afterwards, unfortunately. And we also worked, actually, I think I got the number wrong. It's actually Senate Bill 762. I'll fix that before. I'll send these slides out later. but the bill allocated $220 million for wildfire preparedness, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what we actually need. But it is a step in the right direction in terms of funding, helping communities be more prepared for fire. And a lot of the work that needs to be done comes down to two things that we were advocating for at the legislature. One of those is having Oregon adopt WUI standards, or wildland and urban interface. WUI standards basically mean that areas that are along the edges of urban areas that are interfacing with fire-prone areas, that they need to have certain protections in how they design and build their homes, so that there's less likely that we would see a wildfire spread throughout a community. And these are international standards. There's, I believe, I'm not the person at 1000Friends that's directly working on this, but I believe we're currently in a phase of this bill was passed through the legislature, and now the agencies are trying to figure out the details of what the wildland and urban interface standards will look like in Oregon. And then another really important factor is that we supported the mapping of wildfire risk. Prior to these fires and this legislation, there was no requirement that cities even understand where they're most prone to wildfire risk. And it's really important, if you're thinking about urban growth boundary expansions, for example, to know where these risks are, so that we can kind of build our communities as much as possible in a way that's more fire resilient. And I wish I could speak more to the challenges of wildfires, but it's not my area of expertise. But if you all have questions about it, I can do my best to answer them. And I could also follow up with you about these issues. So with that, happy to go into some questions, and thank you so much for taking the time to hear this.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for all that information. The first question we have is from Charlotte Young, who asks, isn't the fact that ADUs are only rental perpetuating inequity? Those who already own then rent out and get revenue, whereas those who want smaller dwelling don't get to actually own something. Wouldn't allowing homeowners to sell part of their property for an ADU to be built? We know that owning is important to one's financial well-being. Yeah,
that's a really, really good question. And I'll say that although I think a lot of them will be rented, for one, we have a dire shortage of rental housing in general, and we need more of it to hopefully bring down the cost. But even aside from that, some folks will be building accessory dwelling units for their family, and they will own both units and might not be charging rent to some of the people that will be living in the ADUs. What was the other thing? I had one other response to this.
Will they be able to subdivide the lot? And
that's the thing. So another important legislation that went through last year, or maybe it was this year, Senate Bill 458, I believe it was, requires cities to, it's called middle housing. They can do partitions of land for middle housing units. And I honestly can't remember if ADUs were incorporated in that, but under the standards of a duplex, which would be very similar, I think they could actually build something that is like an ADU under the duplex standards and separate the properties so that they could be owned separately. And I think you could even have one building that's smaller than the other to make it so that it's like an ADU, even if they're calling it a duplex. But cities will need to adopt these partition standards that allow middle housing to allow to be owned in fee simple separately. And so that's a great question, and it is important, I think, that we have those opportunities for smaller home ownership opportunities. And fortunately, this legislature thought of that, so it'll be improved in the future.
And it will be just on a jurisdictional requirement, not required by the state via this.
It's required by the state.
Okay, just to be able to subdivide.
Yep.
Okay, cool. The other question is, were all 19 goals in the original SB 100?
No, so it was a really interesting process. And I don't know if I know the history well enough. I believe that the original 14 goals were adopted within the year after Senate Bill 100 was passed. So Senate Bill 100 kind of created a broad framework that said it both created the Department of Land Conservation and Development and told them you need to come up with these goals that will help us comprehensively plan. And then the department went out, and I believe they had, I want to say it was like over 100 meetings over the course of 1 year. Over 10,000 Oregonians participated, and it was probably one of the biggest public engagement efforts ever in Oregon history. And I believe they adopted the 14 goals initially. That they didn't have the special goals around the coast or the Willamette Valley, and then those were adopted, I think, in the 80s. But I'm not super sure about the dates on that.
It's something I believe I've been told is that Lane County is the only county that is required to enforce all 19 goals.
Oh, interesting. That wouldn't surprise me, but I think you're right, because it's one of the only coastal and Willamette River.
Right. Yeah. So lucky us, huh?
Yeah.
What do you or 1000 Friends think about the UGB extension north of Springfield, where it looks as if there are good soils and no services?
Yeah. So we litigated around that with the Land Conservation and Development Commission just prior to my joining 1000 Friends of Oregon. So I can't speak to too much of the detail on that. I wish I could. I guess just in general, we are not, categorically anti-urban growth boundary expansion. Sometimes we can live with one, but we really try to help cities think as hard as they can and put as much pressure as we can on cities to not ignore their housing needs, but think about how we can meet their needs without the need to expand. Because once you develop farmland, you can never undevelop it. And so especially with the issue around infrastructure serving that area, it's a concerning one, but I can't speak to the specifics of that expansion because I just didn't work on it. So I don't know the details well enough. Though if you have more questions about it, I'd be happy to learn more from your perspective and to talk about it and figure out more, because it's somewhere there's a lot of areas in the state and I'm trying to pick them up, but even after 4 years working at 1000 Friends, I don't know them all.
I bet. Yeah, it's pretty complicated. You spoke about a housing needs analysis that cities are going to be required to do on a 6-year basis. Or will their lack of doing that be LUBA liable?
Yes, it will. And we will probably be involved with making sure that those laws have meaning and that the housing production strategies actually get adopted.
And I'm really glad to see that the city of Eugene, anyway, has begun to have pre-approved plans for ADUs, or at least one so far. I didn't know that they would do that for single-family dwellings. Is that, or other housing?
We're hoping that it'll be something they expand into the middle housing options. It might be something that they do after the initial implementation of House Bill 2001 as a separate process. But we're trying to plant the seed now, and hopefully we can do it as possible.
The plans is quite an expense. And as you point out, it'll really speed the plow in terms of approval. So that's a great idea. And you said that you've got some incentives for affordable housing. What have you already named those? Or they? So
the density bonuses are the incentives for affordable housing that I was talking about. These other ones that the cities must consider at the top here, like reducing or waiving the system development charges, those could be tailored just for cities to do that for affordable housing. In some cases, cities already do that in some way, like Springfield, I believe, for affordable housing development, they lower or maybe eliminate system development charges, which can be thousands of dollars per unit. But really, the incentives that I was talking about are these affordable density bonuses for affordable units or accessible units or for tree preservation. And
What would they look like?
Well, the affordable, like, so if, say a lot is big enough that it would allow a triplex, but not a quadplex. If the developer proposed building a quadplex on that lot, and one of those units was guaranteed to be affordable for 20 years, then they could get approval to build a quadplex. And it could be similar for a lot that allows a duplex. They might be able to build a triplex if they were to make sure that at least one of those units was affordable. I'd like to see them even go further and allow like a fiveplex on an area that allows a fourplex, or maybe even like if they have 2 units that are affordable, allow a sixplex and make sure that, and 2 of those units need to be affordable, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
SDCs, I believe some of them are unavoidable. They have to charge, they have to pass on, but who does pay for them? Because the bill's going to come due somehow.
That's a really, no, you're totally right. We recognize that system development charges, they're not just funny money going into a giant coffer in the city. The city has tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that they need to be spending on infrastructure. And these things are decaying, like our existing neighborhoods have areas that are decaying and need to be replaced. Our sewers are pretty old. So the city of Bend, their Parks and Recreation department is actually separate from their city. It's a separate legal entity, and they recently adopted standards so that the rate that they charge for system development charges is proportional to the number of square feet of the home. And this is the way that we want to see system development charges go into the future, because say a single family home with 4 bedrooms compared to like a duplex, they're going to charge today, under today's standards, they would charge double the amount for a duplex where each one has 2 bedrooms as they would for a single family home with 4 bedrooms. So that's despite the fact that there's going to be the same number of toilets being flushed, yeah, they're going to be charging double the amount for a duplex. So I think the future should be really defined by having it proportional, the cost of an SDC being proportional to the impact. And right now we treat single family homes and other types of units as equal, when there's really a lot more, I think, nuance to how that, but I understand that cities are concerned, like changing the methodology is a sacred cow in some ways, because it's scary for them to tamper with something that they need so desperately to pay for their infrastructure. So I think we really need to listen to cities and how they need to do it. But we could be a lot more equitable in, not having smaller, more affordable housing types essentially subsidizing larger, more expensive housing types.
Right. One more question, and again, it's mine, unless somebody else has got something. What is the amount of Eugene's construction excise tax? Is it a percentage? Is it a flat fee? Do you know?
Yeah, it's a percentage, and I'm trying to remember the exact numbers. I believe it was 0.44% for the first 2 years. It was adopted in 2019. And the first 2 years, I believe it was 0.44%. I might be wrong. I could follow up on this.
Of what?
Of the entire, I believe it's the like the end value, like the tax assessed value of the building and the lot. And then
so based on a square footage of the building.
Yeah, or maybe just however the county tax assessor assesses the building. But I'd have to double check on that in terms of how they calculate it. And then I think after the first 2 years, they plan to revisit the issue and raise it up to maybe it was 0.88. But by state law, they cannot they cannot have a construction excise tax that exceeds 1%. But places like Corvallis and Bend have the full 1%. Yeah, and it's not clear to me what rate of construction excise tax would kind of be counterproductive, where it's reducing the amount of housing that gets built. But I think it's important to be aware that that could be an issue, and we might need to make adjustments to it to ensure that it's not self-defeating.
Right. Well, we've come up upon the hour.
Okay. Sorry, I went longer than I thought I would have.
It's always good to have more information than less. And the leaguers are particularly interested in land use planning. So it's been an honor, Alexis, to have you speak. And I'm sure we've all learned something. Thank you very much. And for the rest of y'all, we're going to be not having a December meeting because it's crazy enough in that month. And historically, we never have. But we hope to see y'all in January, one way and or the other. So y'all stay safe and be well. Onward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. Bye-bye, people.